December 17th, 1944. 0530 hours. Honsfeld, Belgium. The darkness before dawn was pierced by the hollow cough of a Maybach engine struggling for life. Inside his Tiger tank, SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper clenched his jaw as the massive 700 horsepower motor sputtered, wheezed, and then fell silent. The silence was broken only by his own furious blow against the turret hatch, the metallic clang ringing out across the frosted Belgian countryside. From below, his driver, Unterscharführer Werner Fröbel, tried again to coax the Maybach into turning. Starter motors whined, fuel lines sucked at emptiness. Nothing. A moment later, Hauptscharführer Fröbel's voice came up from the driver's compartment, tight and strangled with panic. "The reserve tank is dry as well." Peiper's expression hardened. He climbed down from the steel beast, boots crunching into the frozen soil. His command tank, the tip of the spear, was dead. Around him, dozens more machines stood silent. 67 tanks, nearly 150 half-tracks, thousands of Germany's finest Waffen-SS soldiers, all motionless, paralyzed not by enemy fire, but by empty tanks. This was supposed to be the great turning point, Hitler's last throw of the dice. Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Ardennes offensive, was designed to split the Allied armies and capture Antwerp. And yet here, before the operation had even reached its second day, the armored fist of the 6th SS Panzer Army was stalled in a Belgian village most maps barely marked. Through the morning mist, Peiper saw what appeared to be salvation. Ahead, Honsfeld lay abandoned, the American 99th Infantry Division having fled in haste. The evidence of their retreat was everywhere. Fires still smoldered in oil drums, blankets half folded in bunks, coffee steaming in tin cups. And there, stretching in neat rows like a vision from the gods of war themselves, stood pyramids of olive-drab jerry cans. Thousands upon thousands of them. Fuel. Peiper approached as if in a trance. His adjutant, Sturmbannführer Hans Gruner, pried open one of the cans and inhaled. "Benzene," he confirmed. High-octane gasoline. Better than anything the Reich's synthetic plants had produced in months. The men erupted into frantic activity, dragging can after can to the tanks, splashing fuel into thirsty engines. Peiper walked among them slowly, counting. 50,000 gallons. Enough to power his entire Kampfgruppe to the Meuse River. Enough to perhaps alter the course of the war. And yet, as the Tiger tanks rumbled back to life and the frozen air filled with the fumes of American gasoline, a cold realization gripped Peiper. If the Americans could afford to abandon such vast stockpiles, what Germany would guard with entire divisions, then the war was already lost. This was not salvation, it was revelation. Germany had not merely miscalculated the Ardennes offensive, it had misunderstood the nature of the enemy itself. The war for fuel, 6 months earlier, in June 1944, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, had presented the Führer with a report so grim it should have ended all thoughts of offensive warfare. Germany's synthetic fuel industry, the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht, was being annihilated. Allied bombers had struck at the hydrogenation plants in Leuna, Berlin, Brooks, and Blechhammer with devastating accuracy. In April 1944, those plants had produced 175,000 tons of synthetic fuel. By September, output had collapsed to 5,000 tons. Most facilities ran at less than 10% of capacity, their towering distillation towers twisted wreckage. Germany, Speer admitted privately, no longer possessed the industrial base to fuel a modern, mechanized war. The statistics were merciless. In 1944, the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, even counting synthetic production and what remained of Romanian oil fields, scraped together just 33 million barrels, less than 2% of American production. The Wehrmacht was attempting to fight an oil war without oil. Panzers rolled on roads while their supply lines moved with horses. Pilots trained for battle on 60 flying hours instead of 250. The Kriegsmarine surface fleet rusted in port, its U-boats forced to run on batteries to conserve diesel. On German farms, tractors sat idle as peasants returned to horse-drawn plows. The Ardennes offensive required at least 4.5 million gallons of fuel to reach Antwerp. Hitler ordered 5 million allocated. Only half arrived, much of it delayed or lost to Allied air attacks on transport. The entire offensive, therefore, was predicated not on fuel reserves, but on capturing enemy stocks. It was not strategy, it was gambling. Abundance versus scarcity. The contrast with the Americans could not have been sharper. While Peiper's Kampfgruppe crept forward on fumes, the U.S. Army's supply lines surged with industrial confidence. Across France, engineers had laid the pipeline under the ocean, PLUTO, pumping millions of gallons directly from Britain to continental depots. From there, networks like the Cherbourg-Paris line delivered hundreds of thousands of gallons daily to the front. Meanwhile, the Red Ball Express roared day and night. 6,000 trucks ran along dedicated routes, hauling 12,500 tons of supplies daily. Each truck burned 40 gallons of gasoline a day, more fuel than some entire German companies received weekly. By December 1944, American forces in Europe consumed 1.2 million gallons daily, yet received 1.4 million. They were not only sustaining their armies, they were building reserves while fighting a global war. And so, when Peiper's men stumbled upon the depot at Honsfeld and thought themselves saved, they were wrong. What to them was a miracle, a fortune of 50,000 gallons, was to the Americans a rounding error, a forward stockpile abandoned without regret, while behind it pipelines and convoys delivered oceans of fuel with mathematical certainty. For Germany, every liter mattered. For America, millions could be destroyed without hesitation. That was the true discovery at Honsfeld. The discovery of the American depot at Honsfeld allowed Peiper's Kampfgruppe to stagger forward again. But already the timetable of the Ardennes offensive was in shambles. Hitler had envisioned a lightning thrust, armored columns punching through thin American lines, racing west, seizing bridges over the Meuse before the Allies could react. Every hour mattered. But on December 16th, as the offensive began, one tiny American unit disrupted that vision. At Lanzerath, barely 20 miles from the start line, 18 men of the U.S. 394 Infantry Regiment's Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon dug into a frozen hedgerow. They faced an entire battalion of paratroopers from the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, followed by Peiper's armor. The firefight lasted almost a full day. By the time the last American was captured, his ammunition gone, his body numb with cold, Peiper had lost 10 precious hours. 10 hours of tanks idling in the winter cold, engines burning fuel while commanders argued about why the weak Americans had not fled. Peiper himself fumed at the delay. Every mile his column advanced consumed not just fuel, but opportunity. Surprise was evaporating. American artillery was already beginning to adjust. What should have been a swift breakthrough now became a crawl, punctuated by roadblocks, traffic jams, and desperate searches for fuel. Stavelot, the flames of futility. By the afternoon of December 17, Peiper's spearhead reached the Amblev River near the town of Stavelot. Here lay the true prize, a massive American fuel depot, estimated at over 2 million gallons. If captured intact, it would sustain the entire 6th SS Panzer Army for weeks. Peiper's men reached the edge of the town, their panthers and tigers grinding forward through narrow cobblestone streets. But the Americans had not been idle. Engineers had prepared the depot for destruction. As German armor approached, U.S. soldiers set fire to the fields. An inferno erupted. Barrels exploded like artillery shells, geysers of flame shooting into the winter sky. Rivers of fire flowed across snow, sending towers of black smoke visible for miles. The heat could be felt even inside the steel hulls of Peiper's tanks. Peiper ordered his men to salvage what they could. Some tanks rolled forward to drink directly from unignited fuel tanks, hoses running from American barrels into German engines. But the majority was lost. More than 2 million gallons burned away in hours, nearly half of Germany's total allocation for the entire offensive. Gone in a single day. For the Americans, the loss was painful but hardly fatal. Behind the flames, the Red Ball Express thundered on. Pipelines pumped millions of gallons more. Within days, the loss had already been replaced. For Germany, however, it was catastrophic. The arithmetic of war. To grasp the futility of the Ardennes offensive, one must consider the mathematics of fuel consumption. A Tiger II, the pride of German engineering, guzzled 2.5 gallons per mile on roads. In heavy terrain, that figure doubled. A Panther required 1.5 gallons per mile. Even humble half-tracks consumed nearly a gallon per mile. Peiper's column, 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, plus hundreds of trucks, burned thousands of gallons for every dozen miles of advance. In just 3 days, Kampfgruppe Peiper consumed 40% of its total fuel reserve while advancing barely 20 miles. Meanwhile, American divisions seemed to swim in gasoline. A single U.S. armored division carried more than 350,000 gallons in organic supply, enough to support a major offensive for weeks. When Patton's Third Army wheeled north in late December to relieve Bastogne, the maneuver consumed more fuel than Peiper's entire Kampfgruppe had been allotted for the Battle of the Bulge. Even the skies reflected the imbalance. On December 23rd, when the weather cleared, American air forces flew over 2,000 sorties in one day, consuming more gasoline in 24 hours than the entire German Ardennes offensive had in its total reserve. The Reich measured victory in liters. The Allies measured in oceans. The trap at La Glaise. By December 21st, Peiper's advance had ground to a halt. American counterattacks cut off his supply lines. Bridges were blown, fuel depots burned. Kampfgruppe Peiper was encircled in the small village of La Glaise. The situation grew desperate. Tigers and Panthers sat silent in snowy fields, their crews shivering inside powerless hulls. With no fuel, the mighty armored spearhead had become a static target. Peiper ordered defensive positions prepared, hoping for relief from other SS units. None came. On December 23rd, Peiper gave the order: abandon the vehicles. The pride of the Waffen-SS, 119 tanks and armored vehicles, was scuttled or left behind, their fuel tanks bone dry. Only 800 men escaped on foot, trudging east through snow and forest. The Tiger II that still sits in La Glaise today is not merely a battlefield relic. It is a monument to empty fuel tanks, to an army that could build magnificent machines but could not feed them. The greater lesson. For Peiper and his men, the discovery at Honsfeld had seemed a gift. In truth, it was a warning. 50,000 gallons of fuel, enough to make hardened SS officers cheer with relief, was nothing to the Americans. They abandoned such stockpiles casually. They destroyed millions of gallons without regret. Germany's war machine, for all its brilliance in tactics and technology, was strangled by logistics. The Reich had fought World War II on borrowed fuel, from Romania, from synthetic plants, from captured stocks. Once those sources were gone, defeat was inevitable. The Americans, by contrast, fought with a surfeit so vast that generals planned campaigns without ever asking if the tanks could be fueled. The pipelines, the convoys, the endless drums of gasoline ensured not just mobility, but inevitability. Years later, Peiper admitted, finding that depot at Honsfeld was the worst thing. For a moment, we thought we were saved. Then we realized, if they could abandon so much, they had already beaten us. We had drops. They had oceans. The Battle of the Bulge did not merely mark the failure of Hitler's last gamble. It revealed the brutal arithmetic of modern war. Courage, strategy, and even surprise could achieve little against an enemy whose engines would never run dry. And in the Ardennes, amid the snow and the smoke, it was fuel, not bullets, that decided Germany's fate. For years, the German war machine had run on the promise of Romania. The oil fields of Ploiești were the Reich's only major natural source of petroleum, providing nearly 6 million tons annually at their peak. Hitler had declared them the taproot of victory. But by 1944, the taproot was poisoned. The Allies knew the stakes. In August 1943, Operation Tidal Wave sent 178 American B-24 bombers over Ploiești. Losses were staggering, 53 planes shot down, but the message was clear. The Reich's oil was vulnerable. The real destruction came later. In April 1944, waves of U.S. 15th Air Force bombers pounded the refineries relentlessly. By August, after Romania switched sides, Ploiești was gone entirely. Overnight, Germany lost over one-third of its fuel supply. Hitler raged at his generals. Speer quietly told colleagues, "The war is lost. We no longer have fuel for it. Synthetic dreams, bombed to ruin." To compensate, Germany relied on synthetic fuel plants, vast complexes that turned coal into liquid fuel using hydrogenation. It was an ingenious process, and for a time it worked. By 1943, synthetic plants provided over 50% of the Reich's gasoline and aviation fuel. But they were large, fragile targets. Beginning in May 1944, the Allies unleashed the full weight of the combined bomber offensive on them. Luna, reduced to rubble by over 6,000 tons of bombs. Bleckhammer, bombed 20 times in 6 months. Brux, rendered inoperable by autumn. Production collapsed. In April 1944, Germany made 175,000 tons of fuel. By September, less than 5,000. Luftwaffe fighter pilots sat grounded for lack of gasoline. Panzer divisions received rations measured in liters, not barrels. Erich Galland, commander of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, complained, "We have aircraft without fuel." That is no longer an air force, an America's oil empire. Across the Atlantic, the contrast was staggering. In 1944, the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Texas alone outproduced the entire Axis. Fields in Oklahoma, California, and the newly tapped reserves in Saudi Arabia and Venezuela poured out rivers of petroleum. The logistical reach was just as impressive. Tankers carried oil across the Atlantic in endless convoys. Pipelines like Big Inch and Little Big Inch carried crude from Texas to the eastern seaboard, immune to U-boat attacks. Once in Europe, engineers laid fuel lines across France, including the famed Pluto pipeline under the English Channel. The result, American generals never had to ask if fuel existed. They only asked how fast it could be delivered. The Red Ball Express, fuel on wheels. Perhaps nothing symbolized American abundance better than the Red Ball Express. Launched in August 1944, this vast truck convoy system was designed to rush supplies from Normandy to the advancing armies. Over 6,000 trucks ran daily, many driven by African-American soldiers. Each truck carried fuel, ammunition, rations, whatever frontline troops needed. Together, they hauled 12,500 tons per day. The numbers are almost absurd when set against German capacity. The fuel consumed by the Red Ball Express trucks themselves, over 300,000 gallons daily, was more than an entire German Panzer Army might receive in a week. The final desperation. By late 1944, the Reich had become addicted to captured fuel. During the retreat from France, German units siphoned Allied depots, stole civilian stocks, even drained gasoline from abandoned cars. In September, during the retreat across the Siegfried Line, some panzer crews abandoned their tanks not to enemy fire, but to empty tanks. When Hitler conceived the Ardennes offensive, he knew Germany could not fuel it. His generals protested. Walter Model, Hitler's fireman, he warned, "We do not have the oil to reach Antwerp. We will stall." Hitler ignored him. Instead, he gambled that by capturing American reserves, Germany could snatch victory from ruin. It was less a plan than a fantasy that dissolved in fire at Stavelot and in silence at L'Église. Fuel as destiny. When the Battle of the Bulge ended in January 1945, the German army had lost 600 tanks, 1,600 artillery pieces, and over 100,000 men. But more telling than the human or material losses was the fact that most tanks were abandoned with empty fuel tanks. In March, when the Allies crossed the Rhine, German divisions had been reduced to bicycle battalions. Luftwaffe jets, the advanced Me-262s that might have contested the skies, sat idle on airfields without kerosene. Meanwhile, Patton's Third Army was driving 60 miles in a single day, supported by convoys that never ceased. Eisenhower later remarked, "The war was a matter of logistics. We had it. They did not." And thus, in the snowy Ardennes, amid Peipers, stranded tigers, and the blazing American depots, the truth of modern war was laid bare. Strategy mattered, courage mattered, but above all, oil was destiny. For the Waffen-SS men of Kampfgruppe Peiper, the first days of the Ardennes offensive were filled with adrenaline. They had broken through the American front line, captured villages in flames, and found fuel at Honsfeld that gave them hope. Many whispered that this was the second 1940, a repeat of the blitzkrieg that had once humbled France. But as the days wore on, hope drained as quickly as their fuel tanks. At first, the problem was subtle. Orders delayed while commanders argued about rationing, drivers forbidden from idling their engines. Soon, however, the reality was unavoidable. Tanks that had broken down for lack of fuel were left by the roadside. Crews ordered to join infantry columns on foot. Half-tracks were clustered around captured fuel dumps like vultures, their engines coughing and sputtering as they drained the last drops from American cans. Some SS men joked darkly that they had become Kraftstoffjäger, fuel hunters. They broke into barns, siphoned civilian vehicles, even drained gasoline from abandoned Allied jeeps. Yet the laughter did not last. By the third day, men realized they were no longer an armored spearhead. They were a hungry, fuel-starved column, creeping forward only as long as American supplies allowed. The realization at Stavelot. When the Great Fire at Stavelot lit the winter sky, many German soldiers felt something crack inside. They had fought through minefields and ambushes to reach the depot, believing salvation lay ahead. Instead, they saw towers of fire consuming more gasoline than the Reich had seen in months. The sheer waste was incomprehensible. SS Untersturmführer Gustav Schürer, who survived the campaign, later recalled, "We could not understand it. They had so much fuel they could burn it. We guarded every liter as if it were gold. And here the Americans destroyed millions of liters just to keep it from us. At that moment, I knew we had already lost the war." For an army that measured fuel in precious drops, the sight of oceans of gasoline consumed in fire was not just a tactical setback, it was a psychological breaking point. When Peiper's men were encircled in La Glace, the reality of the fuel crisis became unbearable. Tigers, Panthers, and half-tracks lined the narrow streets, their crews shivering inside powerless hulls. Men burned wooden furniture for warmth, while their invincible armored beasts stood silent, impotent monuments of steel. Without fuel, they were nothing more than frozen coffins. On December 23rd, Peiper ordered the impossible: abandon everything. Crews spiked their guns, smashed optics, and poured grenades into engine compartments to prevent capture. In one street alone, 15 tanks were left like dead giants, their turrets askew. The order to abandon the Tigers was particularly bitter. Crews had lived inside them for months, treating the tanks almost as comrades. Now they walked away, hearing the ticking of cooling engines for the last time. At midnight, 800 men slipped out of La Glace on foot. They trudged eastward, through snow and forest, carrying only rifles and what little food they could scavenge. Civilians awoke to find the invincible Panzer spearhead reduced to starving men, stealing bread and huddling in barns. One Belgian villager remembered, "We had been told the Tigers were unstoppable, but in the morning they were just empty shells in our fields, and the Germans walked away like beggars. It was the first time I believed the war would end." The symbol of the Tiger today, one of those abandoned tanks, remains. A King Tiger, number 213, still sits in the center of La Glace. Its fuel gauge is fixed at empty, a silent testament to the reality that defeated Germany. Visitors often marvel at its size, nearly 70 tons of steel, a gun capable of destroying any Allied tank at a mile. But for all its engineering brilliance, the machine was useless without the one resource Germany lacked most. The Tiger is not a symbol of Nazi might. It is a monument to its futility, a reminder that wars are not won by machines alone, but by the invisible lifeblood that keeps them moving. The enemy's abundance. Meanwhile, just 20 miles away, American soldiers were drowning in fuel. Convoys of jerry cans stretched for miles. Drivers cursed when they spilled gasoline into the snow, not because of scarcity, but because of the mess. Some tank crews joked that they should run their Sherman engines just to keep warm, something unthinkable for the Germans. When Patton's Third Army began its famous turn north to relieve Bastogne, The maneuver burned through 350,000 gallons in just a few days, more than Peiper's men had seen in their entire offensive. American quartermasters didn't blink. The reserves were there. The convoys never stopped. The psychological gap was as vast as the material one. German soldiers fought with courage, but in their hearts they now knew courage alone could not move tanks without fuel. Historians often speak of battles in terms of tactics, strategy, and leadership. But the Ardennes offensive revealed another truth. Wars are often decided not at the front, but far behind it, in refineries, factories, and oil fields. Germany's soldiers in the Ardennes did not lose for lack of bravery. At Lanzerath, American paratroopers testified to the tenacity of their SS opponents. At Stavelot, Peiper's men fought through barricades with ferocity. At La Glace, they resisted encirclement until the last cartridges were spent. But tanks without fuel are bunkers, and armies without gasoline are statues. The Wehrmacht had been slowly strangled long before it reached Belgium. Allied bombers destroyed its oil plants. Romanian oil fields slipped away. Synthetic fuel collapsed. When Hitler ordered the Ardennes offensive, his soldiers were already condemned, not by tactics, but by mathematics. Drops versus oceans. The true imbalance can be captured in a single comparison. In December 1944, Germany's entire monthly fuel production, synthetic and natural combined, was less than 40,000 tons. In the same month, the U.S. Army in Europe alone consumed over 200,000 tons. America used in a week what Germany produced in a month. That was the real front line of the war, the front line of industry. Factories in Texas, Oklahoma, and California, pumping out petroleum at a pace that dwarfed anything the Reich could dream of. Tankers and pipelines delivering rivers of oil across oceans and continents. Convoys like the Red Ball Express, turning that oil into motion. Germany had drops. America had oceans. And in a war of engines, oceans always win. The lesson for generals. When the Battle of the Bulge ended in January 1945, Hitler had lost not only his last reserves of armor, but his last hope of maneuver. The Wehrmacht was broken. Its final months were fought on foot, its tanks rusting in forests, its Luftwaffe grounded for lack of kerosene. American generals drew the lesson clearly. Eisenhower later said, "The war was a matter of logistics. We had it." They did not patten, ever blunt, remarked, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have to have gas." These were not metaphors. They were the hard truth of modern mechanized war. Bullets and bravery win battles, but oil wins wars. The fate of Joachim Peiper. As for Peiper, his fate mirrored that of his tanks. Once hailed as Hitler's boldest panzer commander, he ended the Ardennes trudging east on foot, his Tiger tanks abandoned behind him. In the post-war years, he became infamous for the massacre of American prisoners at Malmedy, a crime that overshadowed his battlefield exploits. But for all his notoriety, his most lasting legacy may be the unintentional symbol he left at La Glace, a silent King Tiger, frozen in time, its fuel gauge at empty. A machine built for conquest, defeated not by American firepower, but by American gasoline. The Monument of La Glace. Today, visitors who walk through La Glace see the Tiger II still standing, its massive 88mm gun pointing uselessly across the village square. Children climb its armor. Tourists marvel at its size. Yet the most telling feature is invisible: its emptiness. The tank has no fuel. It never moved again after December 1944. It remains a monument not to German strength, but to German weakness. A reminder that no matter how advanced the machine, without the lifeblood of oil, it is nothing but cold steel. Conclusion: the true decider. The Battle of the Bulge is remembered as Hitler's last gamble, as a clash of armies in snow-covered forests. But beneath the snow, beneath the gunfire and the smoke, the true story was one of fuel. The Germans began their offensive with barely enough gasoline to reach their objectives. They counted on capturing Allied supplies to survive. They did capture some, 50,000 gallons at Honsfeld, millions more in depots at Stavelot and elsewhere. But it was never enough. The Americans could abandon more fuel than Germany could ever hope to seize. And that was the revelation. Not that the Wehrmacht was tactically outmaneuvered, but that it was industrially outclassed. In 1944, the United States was producing 90% of the world's aviation fuel. Germany was scavenging jerry cans. At Honsfeld, Peiper believed he had found salvation. In truth, he had found the proof of defeat. The Tiger tank at L'Église stands today as the final word. Courage, skill, and steel mean nothing without fuel. Wars of engines are wars of oil, and in the Ardennes, the side with oceans of it decided the fate of Europe.